evening, my fellow extraterrestrials. I'm going to try to keep this one short, sweet, and to the point as well. I think by now most of you already know what I think about the whole Eden thing and the snake and all of that, and I'm certain you all know my opinions and beliefs on Lilith. I have certainly written about it enough, and at the time of this video, I will have long since posted the I Am Lilith poem, because it's easier for me to just do a reading of a poem than it is for me to actually get around to making the corresponding videos for my blogs. So yeah, it's been some time since I've done that, actually, since I've written that poem and done that reading, and so this video is long overdue for sure. But if you've seen that and you've read any of my previous work, you know I do not think that the snake in the Garden of Eden was the devil, Lucifer, whomever that is normally attributed to that. I think the snake was Lilith. And the reason I think this is because Lilith was the first opposer to God. It is said that Satan was the snake in the Garden of Eden, but Satan is used to describe opposers, because Satan is literally the Hebrew word for opposer. It is not a person. It is an opposer, someone in opposition to God, someone who does something against God. And the first that we know of to actually do that was Lilith. Most legends say she was created from the same earth as Adam. There's some speculation, some less than canon texts that suggest that she was seraphim, which I kind of like that idea and tend to go with that. I went with that for the poem, of course, because that works. And part of the reason why that suggestion is there is, of course, because later she is the wife of the Prince of the Seraphim who led the Seraphim against God. So there's that, the third opposer. She's the wife of the third opposer. So as far as the snake goes, it makes sense that she would be the snake, that she would be the one to want to converse with Eve and tempt Eve to also free her from servitude of Adam. Because from Lilith's perspective, she was equal to Adam. Why should she bow to him? Why should she submit to him? Why should she be less than him? They were equals, supposed to be equals. So she refused and fled the garden. And upon fleeing the garden, angels were sent to her 3 times. 3 times to try and persuade her back. See, that whole free will thing, God couldn't force her because free will. However, he could certainly try and reason with her, try to persuade her, send angels to try and bring her back, and it never worked. All 3 times she still refused. Since she refused to return to the garden, she was then penalized. She was condemned to never be able to have children, and therefore it was said that she was envious of other women and that she would steal their infants. She was accused of infanticide. She was vilified. Any text that remains of her tends to vilify her. That's likely due to, of course, you all know my beliefs that history is often written by the victors, of course, changed to serve a purpose. Usually a religious or political purpose, the purpose of those in power at the time. And in this case, men. Men in a time when the old ways of the world, the old matriarch societies were being targeted and suppressed. A time period in which you saw like new male leaders rise and enforce new laws upon women. Because prior to the time period I'm referring to being that when you had the Dead Sea Scrolls being written, you had the old biblical text being written, you had the old Judaic religion still relatively new and things being changed and written and modified here and there. So you had the rise of Confucianism. Honestly, I look at the Bible as a historical text of the time period. Now, it's primarily relative to those in that area, in the Middle Eastern area, and so not necessarily like how some people of faith tend to view it as the Word of God. I view it as a historical text, meaning I don't consider it mythology. I don't consider it to be just something made up. I do consider it based in fact. And perhaps some of the more difficult to imagine, the fanciful things, the stories in which may have been embellished, may have been exaggerations, may have been mistranslations for lack of terminology. However, I do consider it primarily based in fact. And a fact of the matter is, during the time period, there were a lot of new male leaders emerging in all various cultures, and Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, everywhere. It was like a battle of the sexes. It was like an ancient battle of the sexes. The old ways, the old matriarch societies fell, and women were suppressed. Women were no longer allowed to rule. Women were no longer allowed to hold any positions of power. Women were made to serve, likely because men got tired of hearing no. Men didn't want to be told no. Women should do what they're told, and it became a battle of the sexes. Now, is it possible that, because I don't want to sound like an overly feminist here or anything, but is it possible that women maybe did something to provoke men in some of these societies? Maybe some of these societies, the women did treat men as lower class, did treat them as nothing but fodder, workers. There's the potential for that in any society. That's kind of how government works. Obviously, I'm not a fan of establishment in any form of it, but regardless of the reason, the time period suggests that this is when the takeover was happening, if you will. This is when women were being forced out of positions of power and made to serve, and men were taking over. Confucianism was a big one amongst the Asian societies and made it all the way to my little archipelago in Japan, and fortunately did not completely take over. However, it certainly left its mark. So, I would like to point out that Japan did have female empresses, okay? Confucianism I don't consider Confucius to be any great person to begin with, but that's an entirely different thing. He was envious of how intelligent his daughter was. That's what his issue was. So, there you have it. He plagiarized all the great thinkers before him. Siddhartha, Laozi, those thinkers. So, Confucianism aside, referring to the Middle East lore here, I do think Lilith may have been an actual person. I think it's fact that Azra was a person and Queen of the Canaanites. Lilith may very well have been a queen, a ruler, somebody that simply refused to be submissive, refused to be less than her husband. She could very well have been a real being in history. And once men took over later on and they had say and they had control over what history was taught, what literature was taught, what to believe, what not to believe, of course any writings of her would have been removed. And although writings of her exist, them having actually made it into the Bible for that time period might have been a bit too hot to handle. There were several stories that never fully made it in because the times were difficult. Times were hard. There was concern about all sorts of things. There was concern about uprising. There was concern about war. There was concern about information being a little too much for the general populace. So there was censorship. That doesn't mean that she wasn't a real person. It doesn't mean that the story didn't happen. However, as far as the actual Eden story and the snake, what we have there is a representation. It might be a representation of a real story that occurred. It might be a representation of a place and a husband and wife and a situation that occurred, but told in metaphor. So the snake very well could represent Lilith, because the snake is Satan. The snake is opposing the will of God. And Lilith, we know, full on opposed. She was not having it. That being said, I can't imagine she would have just gone off and allowed for another woman to be made to serve in her place. I'm sure that the knowledge of this would have prompted her to do something about it. If she found out that, oh, I'm not there anymore, so now you're taking this poor innocent woman and forcing her to now serve Adam, I'm sure Lilith would have had empathy for Eve. And hey, maybe the beings of the time period did have ways of disguising themselves as snakes. Maybe they had snake-like features. There's theories about ancient people having features of snakes. There's theories about Naga. There's all of that too to consider. So perhaps she did enter the Garden of Eden and tempt Eve. In which case, the snake in that story would have been Lilith. And I am full on that was her. But oftentimes, it is kind of just all put together. It's all, the blame is all put on one being. The blame is all typically put on Lucifer. Lucifer was Satan. Lucifer was the one who opposed God. Lucifer was actually his counterpart and the head of his council for a very long time. And he didn't really give up that position until much later. And there were things that led to that. So I'm not seeing him as being the snake. I just can't full on blame him for that. Like, I don't think he really would have had much concern with that. Now, it is said that various angels, like when the seraphim and the various angels were told, you know, here's this man, here's Adam, here's this man that I made, and I made him of mud, dust, whatever, and you are to serve him and to bow to him. Angels didn't like that. Especially not the seraphim. They were of the highest class. They didn't like that. They didn't take too kindly to that. So then you did have the story of pride coming in, because you can't make a man out of mud and tell women and angels and all these beings, hey, this thing that I made is superior to you. You need to be subservient to it. You need to honor it. You need to bow to it. That's not happening. So, of course, I could give examples of stories that are actually historical accounts that I can see potentially having either influenced the story of Eden or having maybe been the inspiration for it. Because, again, I do think the biblical texts, all the various versions of the biblical text, they're just tellings in different perspectives. I think they are historically accurate. You just have to be open-minded when reading them. You have to realize, one, there's multiple variations that were all written in around the same time periods. Two, the text that actually made it into the original Bible, a lot of this was a bunch of old men. A bunch of old men getting together and saying, okay, what do we actually want to include in this text, and what do we think we should maybe bury somewhere? And again, difficult time periods. Some of this was them trying to preserve their history from the destruction of war. So obviously, one could concede that this is at least based in fact, that this is based in some historical events that they experienced or that was passed down through oral legend amongst their people. But the fact of the matter is, this was still a group of men getting together deciding how to tell the stories, how to write them, how to tell them, and which ones to include. So from the start, we don't have a complete picture. Then you have multiple translations and several things lost along the way. Then you have things being edited. We all know so many chapters were cut along the way. But you have things being edited for political reasons, for religious reasons, all various reasons. So to say, oh, well, it's all, you can come at me all day with faith and you can say, oh, it's all God's word and it's all accurate and it's all this. Well, that's fine. I separate faith from fact. I can have faith in something and still want to know what historically actually happened. There's a big difference there. So, to the point, I can have faith without clouding my ability to read through myself and come to my own interpretations and my own understanding of what it is I'm to have faith in. I can have faith, I can have belief without clouding my judgment. Because one thing that people need to realize is, as humans, we don't have the comprehension and the understanding of a higher power. We are limited in our comprehension and understanding. Therefore, we have no choice but to have faith in a higher power because we are limited, whatever that higher power may be. And one does not exclude another. And often we're looking at the same higher power, same stories, just under different terminologies, different tellings. So you can have that, but still want to know, okay, but who were the people involved? Who were the people there that actually lived it during the time periods mentioned? And that is where I tend to focus, is that history, the people involved, the time periods, and I mean, even across the Judaic religions, if you have, you have the Judaic script and you have, say, the Hebrew, you have the Muslim, you have all of it, and you've got these leaders in the room with you and you ask them, okay, well, who is this person? Oftentimes, they will agree on who that person is. They will say, oh, this person is who they call so-and-so, but we call him this. It's just the name that's different. It's not the actual event that's different. It's just that the terms used are different, and their perspectives are different, and their faith is different. So, really, all of that warring and nonsense is exactly that. It's human nonsense is what that is. And the primary argument is that Lilith may have been a very real, very influential and powerful female figure in history. And she may have very well rebelled against her husband, against the leaders in charge, against submission, against a lot of things. It is speculated that the Lilu that is mentioned in Babylonian may or may not be the reference for Lilith, may or may not be the same person. But considering that some of the female characters that either have been completely eradicated from the Bible or have only been briefly mentioned and not in a favorable light, have since been affirmed to be real beings in history who were painted rather unfavorably despite the fact that they were beloved by their people. And this is a male perspective is what this is. This is a male perspective of the time telling this with a purpose. The purpose being to preserve their history, sure, but to do so in such a way that favors the men of the time rather than the women, because the times were changing and it was the men who needed to maintain control and maintain power. So they were also on a side quest to quell the women, put them in a place of submission, keep them from power. It was a tumultuous time period. And there is no doubt in my mind that of the first opposer, it would have been a woman. It would have been Lilith. I am all for that. So anyway, this is obviously a controversial topic and obviously one that we could go off on so many different tirades on, and this video has obviously gone longer than I wanted it to. But if you want to read more about it and you want to read the evidence for yourselves that I have provided in the blog, it's in there. This video is just long overdue. That blog has been up for ever. It has been there for a very long time. So I'm getting caught up. I'm getting there. I'm trying to, for those of you who prefer the videos to the blogs, who don't want to read, I'm trying to get these videos up for you. It's taken me a hot minute, but I'm getting there, and I will keep working on that for you. And in the meantime, stay extra, my fellow terrestrials.